Good day. Today is 8th January 2025, and may I first begin this video by apologising for the sound difficulties on yesterday's video. These are due to technical problems. We were struggling for much of the day to try to get them sorted. We did the best we could. I hope that today's video is not going to be afflicted by the same problems, and in the meantime, my apologies to everybody for the way that it happened. Now, today there's lots of things to talk about. There's been all kinds of further developments in the conflict in Ukraine. There's also some very interesting developments related to the conflict in Syria, which I do intend to get to. But I'm going to begin by some of the recent comments, in fact, by the multiplicity of comments that have now been made by the man who is now indeed lawfully, constitutionally the president-elect of the United States, Donald Trump, about Greenland, Mexico, and the Panama Canal, and Canada. Now, President-elect Trump, has said many comments about all of these countries, basically since he was elected. I haven't yet discussed them in any specific program, and like I think a lot of people, I thought initially that his comments could be interpreted as a form of trolling. I mean, Trump does do that. He does come along. He does say things which are intended to rile people. But, and I wondered whether this was just another example. He did not like Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada. He's got serious issues, as many people in the United States do, about Mexico, connected to issues of the border and other things, the trafficking and all of that kind of thing with Mexico. And it's a long-standing issue. The Panama Canal, obviously an important US strategic asset. And with Denmark and Greenland, and specifically with Denmark, I think that he's also not particularly favourable to the current government of Denmark. But anyway, I thought it was originally trolling, but the fact is that Trump has persisted in these comments, and one of the most fascinating things, one of the most interesting things about the fact that he has been making these comments and has gone on making them and went further into much more detail about them in a long interview he gave yesterday, which I will return to shortly. Anyway, the fact is that he has persisted in doing this, and he's now going further. He's saying that the name of the Gulf of Mexico needs to be changed. He has published a map which shows Canada as part of the United States. He's made further comments about Greenland, and I understand that his son is going to be visiting Greenland. And, well, it doesn't seem as if any longer it's possible to talk about this as trolling. It looks as if at least some of this is intended in some way seriously. And interestingly, he is not getting within the United States the strong pushback for these comments that might have been expected. I was looking today, for example, just before I did this program, at the front page of the New York Times, and they barely discuss these latest comments of Trump. In the Washington Post, on the front page, there is an opinion piece criticizing these comments and saying that what Donald Trump is doing is threatening to use armed force against a NATO ally, in this case presumably Denmark. And there is some truth to this. And some of his comments about Mexico could be interpreted also as threatening use of armed force in a similar kind of way, though I don't myself think this is quite where we've got to. in terms even of Trump's words, just saying. But it is a fact that he was given an opportunity to rule out use of force in terms of these various territorial claims he now appears to be making on behalf of the United States, and he refused to do so. He also said that he was in talks, or at least his team were already in talks with the Panamanian authorities about the return of the Panama Canal, and that he didn't say where those talks were heading. The Panamanian authorities, by the way, have indignantly rejected any suggestion that they would return the Panama Canal to the United States. Anyway, again, Trump suggested that if the talks go nowhere, he was not ruling out the possible option of using military force to take back control of it. So what is going on? What is this all about? Well, like lots of people who observe the political phenomenon of Donald Trump, I'm not absolutely sure. This is someone, a political figure, who has an extraordinary ability to say things which on the face of it appear outrageous, and over time it turns out that there is some method to it after all, which was not discernible at the beginning. And I'm not going to pretend that I find Donald Trump always an easy individual to read. Well, I am going to suggest that perhaps the truth, or part of the truth, is contained in an article that I saw published yesterday in a blog called Institutional War Theory. Trump hints at the return of geostrategy. With the decline of global American influence and the increase in land grabs by competing great powers, Trump may have chosen to restart American imperial expansion to remain competitive. And, well, I read this article, which I thought was an interesting article, and it does to some extent chime with certain opinions which I'm starting myself to come to edge towards, and which I briefly floated in a program I did about 10 days ago on Daniel Davis' Deep Dive. Briefly, it does seem to me as if what is happening is that Donald Trump himself and a certain body of opinion within the United States, not the dominant body of opinion, but the more ascendant one, is starting to look at the state of the world. And they're coming to understand that the unique period, the unique unipolar period, which began basically in 1990, has indeed now conclusively ended. China is now, in purchasing power parity terms, the world's biggest economy, having overtaken the United States itself. Russia is in the process of winning the war in Ukraine. It is quickly re-establishing itself as a great power, as one of the great powers. China and Russia, between them, control a vast amount of resources, population resources, natural resources, oil, gas, strategic minerals, you name it, they have access to it. They also control a colossal territory in Eurasia. And there are other great powers which appear to be appearing just over the horizon as well, though the extent to which they will succeed in establishing themselves as great powers is something that remains to be seen. India obviously is one. In fact, India probably could be defined as a great power already. It has many of the features that a great power has. Indonesia, which, as I discussed yesterday, has just joined the BRICS, is also potentially a great power. So if it can sort out its many internal problems, its severe problems with governance, conceivably Brazil could become a great power at some point in the future as well. But anyway, one way or the other, even if we put aside these rising great powers, Indonesia, Brazil, those sort of places, the world already is a world where we have returned to great powers. In fact, back, I think it was in 2018, a Pentagon document, a Pentagon report discussing the need to rebuild the US's strategic nuclear forces actually had a whole title to a chapter, which was, the title read, as I remember, The Return of Great Power Competition. And the return of great power competition essentially means that the globalist project, which the United States and the Western powers launched themselves upon back in the 1990s, has come to an end. The idea that the United States would be able to establish total supremacy across the entire globe and shape the future of every country and basically lead those countries towards a system compatible with liberal postmodern capitalism, if you like. That idea has basically failed. That project has basically failed. It is incompatible with the rise of great power challenges. So that is one change that there has been. There is also no realistic return to the system which existed before 1990, the period of division of the world in essentially two great armed camps, one led by the United States and one led by the Soviet Union. The period between 1945 and 1990 was essentially a bilateral system in which there were two great centers of power. There were all kinds of other states that existed in a kind of world between these two great power blocks. But the United States, though not a dominant, not globally dominant, it had to always take into account the opinions of the other great power centered in Moscow. Nonetheless, it had clear leadership over its own bloc. That is also fracturing because we no longer have two great powers. We have, once Russia has completed its process of re-establishing itself as a great power, at least three, and probably before long there will be more. And the ideological competition, which marked the period of bipolarity, the world of the Cold War, that has gone probably forever. So in this situation where we're returning to a system much closer to the one which existed in the 19th century in Europe, for example, you have a system of several competing great powers, each of them in a state of constant competition with each other, though probably also willing to cooperate in a kind of concert with each other in certain areas. And if we have that kind of system, we logically return to the world of spheres of influence, which were a feature of that earlier system. And it seems to me that what Trump is doing is he is basically delineating what could be described as the core sphere of influence that the United States is going to seek as we move towards this new system where the United States will be one great power amongst several instead of being the global hegemon. And then if you approach it in that way, then all these various comments that he's making start to make a kind of sense. Because, of course, all of these are territories contiguous to the United States. They surround the American heartland. Canada, obviously, to the north. Mexico, obviously, to the south. Greenland, some say it is part of the American continent. I'm not a geographer, so I can't say. But you can see that this is a huge territory immediately to the west, to the east rather, of the United States, and one which the United States, in the kind of world that I am describing, might want to control in order to deny it to any of the other competing great powers that might potentially challenge it. So in this scheme, Greenland becomes a part of America's sphere of influence. Of course, since Greenland is part of NATO and Denmark is a NATO, Greenland is in part of Denmark and Denmark is a NATO ally, you could argue that Greenland is already a sphere of influence, part of within America's sphere of influence. But then that begs the question about the long-term viability of NATO and about whether Trump and the people who are close to him continue to envisage a long-term commitment by the United States to NATO, to Europe, in a world of competing great powers. It's easy to see how the United States might conclude that the NATO commitment is more a burden than an asset, because the United States takes on obligations to defend the European powers, the European states, and that might not be always consistently in its own interests, and besides, it ties America down. It ties the United States to defending Europe, whereas it really needs to take care of itself. At least that's perhaps the thinking behind all of this. Now, if this is all true, if this is where we're heading, then of course one can argue that when Trump is talking about actually taking control of Canada and taking control of Finland, physical control of Finland, it might actually come to rather less than that. Spheres of influence often involve great powers exercising something that falls short of direct control of a territory. A classic example is Finland during the Cold War, which lay within the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. And the Soviets, to a great extent, were able to influence Finnish foreign policy and the economic relationships that Finland engaged in, without, of course, exercising direct control over Finland. There were no Soviet troops based in Finland, and the Soviets did not have direct control over over Finnish society or the political system there. So that is a classic example of an old-style sphere of influence arrangement, and it could be that in time this is something similar to what Trump is envisaging, or at least some of the people around Trump might be envisaging for some of these places that Donald Trump is talking about. A kind of updated and expanded Monroe Doctrine. Of course, it could go beyond this. And here I I'm going to be very careful because, I mean, I don't know. I still find it all but impossible to imagine that Trump seriously believes, for example, that the United States could simply take control of Canada with its 25 million people and all of the rest could simply march in and take control of it against their wishes. And I don't get the sense that most people in Canada particularly want to become a part of the United States. Just to say, Greenland does have an independence movement. In fact, I believe that the Prime Minister of Greenland is a member of Greenland's independence movement, though I'm not going to pretend I know very much or indeed anything about Greenland's politics. But I gather it's a territory with a population of around 60,000 people. Whether it is really intending to become an independent state, I'm not sure. If it does, I can very easily see how it could quickly fall under the influence of the huge neighboring superpower, which is, of course, the United States. Because if Trump is seriously planning an occupation, of military occupation of Greenland, well, one can imagine how it might come about. Greenland declares some kind of independence of Denmark and then is pressured by the United States into some kind of direct engagement with the United States, and this might fall short of war. Anyway, I don't want to explore this too far and too deeply because I don't myself know exactly what it is that Trump is thinking. If you want, as I said, an interesting discussion of this topic, that article on that blog, Institutional War Theory, Trump hints at the return of geostrategy, or if you like, conventional, old-fashioned geopolitics, the kind that Mackinder used to deal in back at the start of the 20th century. Well, if you want to, as I said, see this discussed, look at the scale of the territories that Trump is talking about acquiring and the enormous resources that they possess and the way in which control of these resources, I'm talking now about direct control of these resources, would give the United States, if it could consolidate control over them, strategic depth in terms of its competition with rival great powers, then I would suggest, as I said, that you read this article. As I said, I don't myself want to go too far. I don't want to discuss this in too much detail because I don't know where this is going. And it may be that, as I said, it will all eventually peter out. But one thing I will say, every point I have made, I am sure has to some extent been considered or thought about by at least some people in Europe. Now, mostly, I suspect, European politicians, European political leaders have little understanding or thought about this. They probably think that this is just a case of Donald Trump sounding off and that this shouldn't be taken too seriously. But there are some people, certainly in London and Paris and perhaps even Berlin, who perhaps might be able to think a little bit in the way that I have just done, consider what Trump might be saying and what it perhaps means. And the key point here, and the most important one of all perhaps, is that all of these moves, all these comments that Trump is making, what they show is that Trump is no longer thinking of a NATO-based US foreign policy. Obviously, taking over Greenland against the wishes of the country currently in control of Greenland, which is Denmark, would be an extraordinary act of aggrandizement at the expense of a NATO ally. One does wonder how people in Denmark would feel about it. But the point is that if Trump is indeed thinking about spheres of influence, if this is indeed the long-term plan to retrench, to pull back from Europe, to concentrate on territories closer to home, to build, if you like, a kind of sphere of influence centered on the United States, which the United States can not only protect, but will be able to directly develop and profit from. Well, in that case, that would confirm the worst fears that the Europeans have, which is that the United States is going away, that it is looking at the current situation in the world. It is saying that Europe is no longer the strategic asset that it once was, that it makes no sense for the United States to continue to support and defend Europe in the way that it did during the Cold War, and that it is time for the United States to leave and to take care of problems, literally, in this case, closer to home. And that, for the Europeans, will be extremely alarming. They will be very worried that the United States indeed might be going away. And of course, in a world of spheres of influence, when the great powers start re-establishing spheres of influence, some of them might hope that they still find themselves in an American sphere, but others might find that that option is not made available to them. And given their own difficulties, their own military problems, and their own military difficulties, it may be that they decide they're going to have to face accommodations with the other great power on their doorstep, which is, of course, Russia, which they would find distinctly uncomfortable. Now, I'm going to finish this somewhat tentative discussion by saying that obviously what all this would mean, if we're talking about territorial aggrandizement, is a return to imperialism in the early 20th century sense, the time when the great books analyzing imperialism, books by Hobson and Lenin, were written. They tended to see imperialism as a struggle between competing great powers seeking to acquire resources. It looks as if this is some kind of a return to that. But I'm not going to discuss that further in this program. In some ways, as this article in Institutional War Theory implies, what is being proposed here is, in fact, a strategy, a long-term strategy for retrenchment and retreat. Anyway, there we are. Now, that was not the only thing that Trump has been saying in the last 24 hours, because he's also talked about Ukraine and about the conflict there. And what he has said, actually, has been extremely interesting. Now, again, he has been extremely critical of the Biden administration and has said that it was the Biden administration whose incompetent actions were the ultimate cause and trigger of the whole conflict. And importantly, he has honed in on the question of NATO. He says that he understands completely Putin's concerns about Ukraine and NATO, and has basically always done so. He makes it quite clear that he does not want to see Ukraine in NATO. And that appears to be the first, if you like, the founding point of his whole approach to the conflict in Ukraine. And this is very important because, of course, Putin has repeatedly said, he's repeatedly made it clear that for him, NATO entry on the part of Ukraine crosses a fundamental Russian red line. Now, Trump saying that he understands this, he understands Putin's concerns about this, he's not really interested in seeing Ukraine in NATO. Now that gives a commonality in position between the Russians and the Americans, between Trump and Putin, which conceivably could be taken forward and could be built on. But it's important to understand that there are also problems. Because the one thing the Russians have learned over many years, going all the way back to the Cold War, is that one can reach understandings with a person who occupies the Oval Office at any particular point in time. But there is no guarantee that this person's successor will ever feel bound by those understandings. Back in 1990, the Russians believed that they had reached an understanding with George H.W. Bush and his administration that NATO would not be expanded beyond the territory of the former East Germany, and that NATO would never establish and that no Western military infrastructure would be established on the territory of the former states of the Warsaw Pact. And when George H.W. Bush ceased to be president of the United States, his successor, Bill Clinton, appeared to give similar assurances in the first 2 years of his presidency. We now have all of this on record. This has been repeatedly denied by many people in the United States and in the West, but the record, the archival record, makes the fact that these assurances were given not once but many times really indisputable. As we know, that understanding, because that is all that it was, came to nothing. Because starting from 1994, Bill Clinton's policy changed. And where before he had appeared to go along with the understanding reached between Gorbachev and Bush, George H.W. Bush, after 1994, the Clinton administration began to think further about NATO expansion. It decided that NATO expansion was the way to go. And in fact, NATO expansion began in the late 1990s and it continued throughout the 2000s, culminating in that disastrous decision, that calamitous decision in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, the NATO Bucharest summit, basically to invite Ukraine to apply for NATO membership. A strange formula, but one that basically told the Ukrainians that NATO wanted them and which telegraphed to the Russians that one day Ukraine would indeed be part of NATO, despite, from a Russian point of view, this being, as the American ambassador of that time, Bill Burns, was saying, the brightest of Russian red lines. So, how did the Russians know? Why should the Russians believe that any understanding they reach with Donald Trump, that NATO will not be expanded to Ukraine, is going to be honoured. Now, back in 2021, when the Russians proposed to draft treaties which would in fact have ended the expansion of NATO eastwards, the Russians, precisely because they said that they had so many doubts about the value of American promises, they said that they wanted those treaties actually ratified by the US Senate. I have to say that even if there was a treaty whereby the United States took on formal obligations not to expand NATO into Ukraine, the evidence of recent history is that the United States is perfectly capable of scrapping those treaties and moving forward and changing its stance on this. After all, there was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which had also been ratified by the United States Senate, and it was scrapped. And you could say the same was true about the INF Treaty and all sorts of things. And of course, there are also other ways that you could effectively integrate Ukraine fully into NATO structures, whilst not having Ukraine formally inside NATO. You could go on pretending that Ukraine was not a member state of NATO, even if in every respect and particular it actually was. So how do you do it? How do you get the Americans, tie the Americans down and get them to agree to this? I'm going to say straight away that for the moment, I think that there is absolutely no chance whatsoever that the US Senate would agree to a treaty, would ever ratify a treaty which precluded once and for all Ukraine from joining NATO. Just to say, I believe that a treaty requires 2/3 of the Senate to vote for it. And frankly, there isn't that 2/3 support in the Senate there. It's just not going to happen. So how is this all going to be done? Well, the answer is I don't know, and I'm not sure that it can be. And this is going to be a major problem going forward, because the Russians have been saying repeatedly that they require cast iron guarantees, and I doubt that they believe that Trump himself is in a position to offer them. What's going to make it worse is that, of course, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and of course many people in the United States, will vigorously oppose a settlement of the conflict which takes Ukraine's membership of Ukraine off the table. Now, there may be ways round. One obvious way would be Trump pushing the Ukrainians into agreeing a treaty, an actual formal treaty between Ukraine and Russia, changing again the terms of its constitution, that it was Ukraine, in other words, that took the decision that it would never join NATO. That very nearly came about in Istanbul in April 2022. And that might be ultimately the way forward if there is going to be a peace. But that is going to be fragile also given the state of Ukraine itself. Bear in mind that Ukraine, when it became independent, also pledged that it would not join NATO. It said that it would remain a neutral country. It, in fact, enshrined this in its own constitution. And as I've discussed in many programs, many of the other legal and foundational documents that were agreed following the end of the Cold War, including the Budapest Memorandum, were created in the context of a Ukrainian commitment to long-term neutrality. So, it might be fragile, and it may be that the Russians will say to themselves that, yes, we accept this arrangement, we accept a treaty with the Ukrainians, but obviously it cannot be with the current government in Ukraine. There will have to be a complete rearrangement of the political structures inside Ukraine. And to say it frankly, if that's going to happen, we're not just talking about regime change, but about also Russian involvement long-term in Ukrainian domestic affairs, extending far beyond the period of this present war. So that's one thing. The other way around would be to do what the Russians have been seeking basically since the Cold War ended. Arguably, they've been seeking it since the end of the Second World War itself. And that is a general agreement between the United States, Russia, and all of the countries in Europe about the complete reconstruction of the security architecture in Europe. In other words, a reorganization that either demotes NATO significantly or does away with it entirely. Now, if the things I was saying at the start of this program about Donald Trump thinking more in terms of spheres of influence and not really being so concerned about NATO are true, that might not be a problem for Donald Trump himself. But again, it would be an extremely hard sell indeed in Europe and with some people in the United States. Anyway, we will see where all this is going. But it is interesting that Trump is talking in this way. His officials, or the people who are making up his team, are apparently telling people in private that the United States is not keen to give long-term security guarantees to Ukraine. And certainly Trump himself is not keen to give long-term security guarantees to Ukraine or give long-term security guarantees to the Europeans if they become involved in Ukraine. And he's absolutely ruling out any American commitment of troops and other things like that to Ukraine as well. So, despite a lot of the noise we have been hearing over the last couple of months about coercion of the Russians into making big concessions, ideas about imposing more sanctions on exports of Russian oil, escalating support for Ukraine, that kind of thing. It's now becoming, I think, increasingly clear that Trump is moving in a completely different direction. He really does want to end the conflict in Ukraine, or at least he wants to extricate the United States from that conflict. And this, by the way, fits in very well with what I was saying earlier about his comments about Greenland, Panama, Mexico, and Canada, that he's ultimately looking forward to a world of returning to concepts of spheres of influence. Well, that's all I'm going to say about this today. Now, there's been a very interesting and really rather angry comment from Robert Kagan, who is the husband of Victoria Nuland. Robert Kagan could be described as the neocon pope. He is also somebody, I mean, he seems to be the major intellectual force within the neocon movement, if intellectual force is the correct term. And of course, the Kagan family are also deeply involved with the Institute for the Study of War. But anyway, Robert Kagan, has now made certain comments which speak of his intense frustration about the way events are going. And he said that America's predictions about Russia's inability to withstand crippling sanctions, have they proved correct so far? Russia has instead successfully adapted and adjusted, finding workarounds on trade, oil, and financing. Ukrainian morale is already sagging under Russian missile and drone attacks, and the prolonged uncertainty about whether the United States' vital and irreplaceable support will continue. And he goes on to say that Trump is not interested in Ukraine, and this is a matter for him of obvious deep concern. Now, I wonder whether Robert Kagan, who is nothing if not extremely well connected, is perhaps better informed about things in Washington than certainly I am, and certainly others might be. Whether he hasn't suddenly understood that when Trump says that he wants to extricate the United States from the Ukraine crisis, he's actually serious about this, and that in place of Kagan's beloved neocon project, these aspirations for establishing some kind of global system centered on the United States, what Trump envisages instead is something much closer to the world that existed in the late 19th and early 20th century, in which the United States simply becomes another great power. Trump would hope the most powerful, but just nonetheless a great power centered on its own sphere of influence, controlling the territories located around it. For someone like Kagan, that vision would be absolutely anathema. He would see it as a betrayal of the whole ideology that he and other neocons have constructed. After all, one of the think tanks that he created, was entitled Project for a New American Century. In other words, he envisaged a world in which the entire system would be centered on the United States. So anyway, we'll see. Now, since I am on the topic of Donald Trump, perhaps this is the right moment to turn to an article that has appeared in Axios, another article which has appeared in Axios about US missile strikes on Iran. I discussed a previous article in Axios on this topic and about the fact that Jake Sullivan and other officials within the Biden administration appeared to be pushing for President Biden to authorize military strikes against Iran in the last weeks of his presidency. Well, according to this latest article from Axios, even though the idea of strikes on Iran whilst Biden is president has been put to bed, it looks as if the advocates of military strikes against Iran have not gone away, and that they are now lobbying Donald Trump to authorize them. So let's just look at this article. It says its title, and it appeared on the 6th of January. Iran 2025 nuclear crisis awaits Trump. And we're told that Iran's recent nuclear advances give President-elect Trump a crucial decision to make in his first months in office. Try to neutralize the threat through negotiations and pressure, or order a military strike. And the article goes into great length about how Trump and his advisors are planning to quickly return to the maximum pressure campaign they conducted against Iran between 2018 and 2020. For the record, I don't recall that maximum pressure campaign was ever formally called off by the Biden administration. I don't recall that any of the many sanctions, additional sanctions, which were imposed on Iran by Trump during his first term were ever walked back by the Biden administration. Just saying, I do accept that perhaps the Biden administration didn't bring to the maximum pressure campaign the same focus and energy that Trump's people did. But anyway, just say. Anyway, we're told that that's what Trump and his people would prefer to do. They want to conduct essentially an economic war against Iran other than conduct a military attack on Iran. But then we go on to read, several Trump advisors privately concede Iran's program is now so far along that the strategy, i.e. the maximum pressure strategy, might not be effective. That makes a military option a real possibility. And as to who these advisors are, well, we then read that Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dreher, met Trump at Mar-a-Lago in November. Dermer came away thinking there was a high likelihood that Trump would either support an Israeli military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, something the Israelis are seriously considering, or even order a US strike. Two sources who spoke with Dermer after the meeting tell Axios. So the article goes into some detail about why this is a dangerous situation, that Iran has now developed its nuclear forces to the point where it has taken its nuclear enrichment program to the point where it could achieve a breakout, supposedly within days. But it's clear when you read the article itself that what is actually happening is that the people who are advising Trump to conduct a military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities are first and foremost the Israelis, though it does seem that they are getting some support from some people within Donald Trump's administration. And remarkably, we are then told that there was a virtual meeting of G7 countries 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks, in other words, in December. It ended with the conclusion that Iran would be the primary issue to contend with in 2025. Everyone agreed, this is a quote from a diplomat who attended the meeting and who's spoken to Axios, everyone agreed, and by the way, that means a Biden administration diplomat, just saying, everyone agreed that we will have to do something or there will be a huge crisis. That's not only because Iran has shrunk its nuclear breakout time down to a matter of days, but also because the ability of the Western powers to snap back crippling nuclear sanctions on Iran under the 2015 nuclear deal will expire in October. This means the United States and its European allies would lose much of their economic leverage over Iran, adding urgency to diplomatic efforts in the first half of the year. The point about the snapback of the crippling nuclear sanctions comes from the various Security Council resolutions that go back to the original agreement that was made between Iran and the Western powers, and by the way, Russia as well, to limit its nuclear enrichment program back in 2015. I consider this to be, by the way, a facile excuse, as we've repeatedly seen. The United States, the Western powers, are uninterested in whether or not sanctions have UN Security Council sanction. They've shown repeated willingness to impose unilateral sanctions themselves, and they have to be aware, they must be aware, that in just a few days, the Russians and the Iranians are going to be signing a partnership agreement which opens the way for both Russia and China and the other BRICS states, and bear in mind, Iran itself is a BRICS state, to press forward with economic cooperation with Iran. Importantly, this Axios article never mentions the Russian-Iranian Strategic Partnership Treaty. It doesn't mention BRICS. It doesn't mention the fact that Iran is now a member of BRICS. None of this appears anywhere inside the article. But we see that someone apparently thinks that there is a time window of about 6 months in which some kind of a military strike against Iran should be launched. Whoever that was, and as I said, one of the diplomats who's been briefing Axios is a diplomat serving the Biden administration. Whoever that was, whoever those people are, and the Israelis clearly are involved, has been lobbying Washington for help to launch this strike on Iran. Apparently, Jake Sullivan was fully part of that lobbying effort. We learned about that in the previous Axios article. And now that lobbying campaign is beginning all over again, but this time working on Donald Trump. Israeli officials have met with him. Other people within the administration are talking to him. They're telling him maximum pressure on Iran isn't going to work. Iran is now close to breakout. Perhaps they're telling him about the partnership agreement with Russia. Perhaps they're pointing out to him that Iran is going to is now a member of BRICS, that Iran is fairly soon going to be, at least if not fully sanctions proof, at least sanctions resilient. And they're telling him, we've got to move and move quickly, and you've got to launch this strike on Iran within the first 6 months, the first half year of your presidency. Well, we will see whether Trump goes along with that. I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate, but the pressure is clearly there. The other very interesting thing that's coming out of all of this is that the G7 apparently have all concluded, have all come to the decision that in Iran, it is now Iran, not apparently Russia, that is the biggest priority. Everyone agreed that we will have to do something or there will be a huge crisis. The G7, at the virtual meeting of the G7, they all came to the conclusion that Iran would be the primary issue to contend with in 2025. In my previous program, I said that having failed against the Russians, the neocons now want to push us towards a confrontation with Iran. And well, here you are, here you see it. End one war, start another. Biden, in his last weeks, isn't in a position to do it, so start working on Trump instead. Well, I hope that Trump gets good advice about this, because I remain of the view that a war with Iran would be an absolute disaster. I think it would deepen the crisis, the already existing crisis in the Middle East. I think that Iran is most unlikely to be the military pushover that some people imagine. Of course, I'm not a military person, as I've discussed many times, but that is my view. And I think that what Trump risks is, even as he tries to extricate the United States from a losing war, a losing proposition in Ukraine, he's going to be pressured by the neocons and by his friends in Israel to reinvest in another losing proposition, this time against Iran. And all of this is most interesting because it comes alongside a cluster of articles that have appeared in the Israeli media about how other Israeli activities over the last year or so have failed to achieve the objectives that were hoped or expected of them. So there's been, for example, an article. It's in Israel Hayom. I'm not quite sure what kind of a journal that is, but from the look of it, it is a very hardline article, a very hardline journal in terms of Israeli policy. Anyway, the article reads, controversial general's plan in northern Gaza picks up steam. And it is, in fact, a plan cobbled together by 8 members of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, who recently signed a letter demanding that the new defense minister, Israel Katz, immediately replace the operational plan in Gaza. Now, I ought to say that the new plan that is being outlined, makes the blood run cold, at least my blood run cold. I'm not going to describe it. I would say that those who are bringing a legal case against Israel in The Hague, legal cases against Israel in The Hague, are going to find plenty of material to advance both of those cases if this plan is ever implemented. I mean, it is absolute scorched earth policy. But the essential point about this plan is that the current plan in Gaza is failing. They say that the situation in Gaza is that Hamas is constantly renewing and reinforcing itself, that in effect Israel is locked into a war of attrition, and that the current policy is never going to defeat Hamas in the way that it is intended to do. And, well, that does accord with my own analysis of the situation. We read they're advocating for the implementation of what's called the General's Plan. They believe this approach will lead to effective control over the territory and population. I'm not going to describe the methods, which, as I said, horrify me. You can read this article if you wish, and you will find them all set out there. They talk about cleansing the enemy from Gaza and striving for a decisive victory rather than stagnation and a war of attrition in which Israel bears the brunt of exhaustion. And on that, by the way, I agree. And they say that we repeatedly send our soldiers into neighborhoods and alleys. They're conquered multiple times before. These are areas IDF leaders have declared cleared of Hamas battalions and enemy presence. Yet in these same places, we continue to pay a terrible and unbearable price in blood. And basically, they are admitting that Israel is facing an unending crisis in Gaza, that the war that Israel is now finds itself in a war of attrition, and this is not a war of attrition that Israel can bear, though their solution to that problem, as I said, is one that leaves me utterly appalled, and which I sincerely hope is never implemented. Now, all of that has come alongside another article, which is this time about Syria, and which I saw in a more mainstream Israeli newspaper, the Jerusalem Post. And it is really, again, a most remarkable article. It informs us about the findings of something called the Nagel Committee. Israel must prepare for potential war with Turkey, Nagel Committee warns. The committee established by the government, Netanyahu's government, warns that Turkey's ambition to restore its Ottoman-era influence could lead to heightened tensions with Israel, possibly escalating into conflict. So the article then talks about the importance of Israel beefing up its defense spending, acquiring even more weapons, F-15s and all that kind of thing, improving, updating the air defense system, the Israeli air defense system, the David sling and all of that. But then it goes on to say that the article's main point is Israel must prepare for a direct confrontation with Turkey, according to the Nagel Committee's latest report on the defense budget and strategy. The committee warns that Turkey's ambitions to restore its Ottoman-era influence could lead to heightened tensions, with Israel possibly escalating into conflict. The report highlights the risk of Syrian factions aligning with Turkey, creating a new and potent threat to Israel's security. Israel must prepare a direct confrontation with Turkey. The threat from Syria could evolve into something even more dangerous than the Iranian threat, the report states, warning that Turkish-backed forces might act as proxies, fueling regime instability. The committee's assessment comes amid Turkish President Erdogan's increasingly assertive policies in the region, which some analysts view as antagonistic to Israel's interests. And then we go on to read, the Nagel Committee submitted its recommendations to Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Katz, and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, the latter being an extreme hardliner. And we go on to read that Netanyahu says that, this is a quote from Netanyahu himself, "We are witnessing fundamental changes in the Middle East. Iran has long been our greatest threat, but new forces are entering the area," clearly he means Turkey, "and we must prepare for the unexpected." This report provides us with a roadmap to secure Israel's future. So, well, there it is. That's Israeli articles about Israel's current military and security situation. Over the long term, the collapse of the Assad government is likely to make Israel's security position worse, not better. Turkey, extremely volatile, incredibly bad-tempered. President Erdogan has been making increasingly fiery statements about the Kurds. He talks about how he might send the Turkish army into Syria at a day's notice. He's talking about how he will do everything in his power to ensure Syria's territorial integrity, which of course is again directed at the Kurds. He's basically openly talking about a war between Turkey and the Kurds in Syria. The Kurds, of course, are historic Israeli allies, undeclared allies, but allies nonetheless. There is a struggle for influence between Turkey and Israel in Syria, and the two, unable so far to sort out spheres of influence, risk finding themselves in potential conflict with each other. And the collapse of the Assad government has removed an element of stability and predictability from the situation. It has brought to power in Syria, or at least apparent power in Syria, political movements that share the ideology and are aligned with Hamas, and whose victory Hamas itself has welcomed. And there are now fears, apparently, in Israel that the victory in Syria in the long term is going to make Israel's position worse. And Netanyahu himself is concerned about it. And an Israeli committee is warning about this. And, well, we have to now start another round of arms build-up in Israel, acquire more weapons, buy more F-15s and other weapons from the United States, spend more money at a time when Israel's economy is already in recession and when the financial stresses are increasing, more money in order to protect ourselves from more security threats that are being created continuously all around us. Well, there it is. I did say this could happen when the Assad government fell. I said that both Turkey and Israel, and Turkey cannot realistically afford an open-ended confrontation with Israel, and by extension with Israel's ally, the United States. Anyway, I did warn that this could happen, that both Turkey and Israel might bitterly rue the day when they, in their own different ways, but perhaps with some degree of cooperation with each other, both engineered Assad's fall, and we see how things are playing out. And we see that even a hardline militant committee within Israel's parliament, is talking about Israel being locked into a war of attrition in Gaza. It wins control of particular streets, claims victory over them, loses control over those streets as soon as the troops move elsewhere. Hamas is far from broken, far from defeated. A war of attrition, an unending war of attrition, exactly the kind of war of attrition that Daniel Davis and others predicted, Alistair Crook predicted, and the events in Syria have not changed that at all. So, one possible way out of this would be to try to achieve a long, sustained peace. That might be achieved through coming to some kind of settlement with the Arab states, with the Palestinians, with those people. There's been plans and proposals, endless plans and proposals about how that might be achieved. But we see instead that the course that's going to be taken is towards further escalation. So Israeli officials lobbying first Biden and now Trump to authorize a strike against Iran. Israeli officials now worrying about a war with Turkey and talking about the need to upgrade even further Israel's defense forces to prepare for the war with Turkey. Israeli officials worried about the danger from the groups that now have taken control of Syria, and the Israeli generals and hardline members of the Knesset advocating policies in Gaza to end the war of attrition there, which, as I said, I find too horrifying to describe or talk about on this program. You can go and find out for yourself what they mean. They do mean mass displacement of people, and that, I think, to be frank, is quite likely a euphemism for even worse things. But anyway, there it is. So, Israel, as far as I can see, at a strategic dead end. The conflict in Syria has not resolved, the victory in Syria has not resolved those underlying problems, and yet the only solution, apparently, is to escalate even more, to do more of the same, creating more enemies, perhaps now Turkey as well. Problems which in the end neither Israel nor the United States can solve. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation in the Middle East. We'll see whether Donald Trump does indeed do what these advisors want him to and orders a strike against Iran. And we'll see whether the Israelis and the Turks really do get into conflict with each other, or whether, as I still think more likely, for the moment at least, they will come to some kind of tacit understanding to divide Syria into spheres of influence, though even that might be difficult to manage well. Now, lastly, I have to come back again to the topic of the war in Ukraine. Now, there's been a really quite extraordinary article in the Washington Post, which basically confirms, as far as I'm concerned, the point I've made several times, which is that we are talking about a situation where we have moved, where basically, as far as the United States is concerned, nihilism has been elevated by some people into a form of statecraft. I said that in a video that Alex Christoforo and I recently did on the Duran. But this article in the Washington Post, actually it is an article published by the editorial board. Anyway, it reads as follows: Ukraine risks losing the war. A Trump-imposed bad deal would be worse. A settlement that dismembers Ukraine and rewards Putin will undermine US credibility. And the article then goes into some detail about how Ukraine is losing the war, how the Russians are advancing. I don't know anyone any longer who seriously believes that Ukraine is winning the war. No doubt there are some people who continue to harbour those illusions, but I don't know of any serious commentator or analyst who believes that anymore. So the Washington Post acknowledges that the Russians are winning the war, and it acknowledges that Ukraine is losing the war, and it also acknowledges that the trend in the war is for the Russians to go on winning. Ukraine is losing troops at a rate far beyond what it can sustain and continue fighting. The official casualty estimate of 400,000 killed or wounded is considered a vast undercount. That is an interesting admission, by the way. The Russians, for the record, put Ukraine's losses, dead and wounded, at around 900,000. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying that's what the Russians say. The Washington Post says that the official estimate, 400,000 killed or wounded, is a vast undercount, which it certainly is. Thousands of exhausted Ukrainian soldiers are deserting the front lines. Only last year, Ukraine began drafting men 25 and older. The previous age was 27. Some have been pressing Ukraine to start drafting men as young as 18. Ukraine is short of men, yet time is the most important commodity that Ukraine is losing. And then it talks about the fact that Trump has shown little interest in Ukraine and clearly wants to extricate the United States from Ukraine. And the other problem that the Ukrainians have is that the other time constraint for Ukraine is a growing wariness in Europe and a desire to find an end to the conflict that is devouring many of the continent's scarce military hardware stocks. American military stocks are being depleted as well, but the Washington Post doesn't want to talk about that. Europeans are quietly shifting to the idea of negotiations based on a land for peace formula as the best way to resolve the war in the event of a US aid cutoff. Now, about a US aid cutoff, here perhaps it's worth making a point which few do, which is that the Biden administration in the last couple of weeks has been burning through whatever was left of the congressional appropriation that was voted through back in April. So there is no money left from the United States that the United States can send that has been authorized by Congress. The US Treasury has provided, or says it's going to provide, funding through the World Bank in the form of a $20 billion loan paid for by interest from frozen Russian assets. There are big question marks over whether that is legal. The fact that this money is being, I'm going to say it, laundered through the World Bank suggests to me that it is not. I wonder whether the Trump administration would be prepared to continue to do that. But suffice to say, and if we put aside this question of what might happen with the frozen Russian assets, unless there is a further appropriation by Congress, and last month Speaker Johnson refused to propose one, refused to put one forward despite being asked to do so by the Biden administration. Unless there is a further appropriation by Congress, then US aid to Ukraine, well, it will not end completely, but it cannot be conducted on anything like the scale that we saw in 2022, 2023, and 2024. So, Ukraine is going to lose American aid, and the Europeans can't step in and make up the difference. So, the Washington Post then goes on to say, Ukraine can hardly survive another year of this devastating war. An interesting admission again. But the haste to find a negotiated settlement could produce a bad one that would reward Mr. Putin for his land grab and guarantee he will launch a new attack for more territory once he has a chance to rebuild his depleted arsenal. What depleted Russian arsenal is the Washington Post talking about? Anyway, let's put that aside. And then we also go on to read that such a peace deal would be a blow. It would undermine confidence in the United States on the part of Ukrainians. And it would also, and this is something else that's been said in the article, it would also convey that the United States and its allies lack staying power and their promises come time-stamped as valid only until the election day. How might China take such a message as its autocratic president, Xi Jinping, contemplates whether to make a military move to try to seize the self-governing democratic island of Taiwan? It's all about American credibility now. Never mind Ukraine. Never mind what happens to Ukraine. Let Ukraine be defeated, because the logic of this is better. See the war go on until Ukraine is defeated. Then compromise with the Russians in ways that might preserve something of Ukraine. Better do that, because if you agree about peace, well, you're setting a bad example, and people like Xi Jinping might take advantage. And the Ukrainians themselves might harbor a sense of betrayal. They're going to feel that sense of betrayal anyway. Just saying. Well, I'm going to say it straightforwardly. This type of thinking sucks. It is absurd. It is, again, making Ukraine a sacrificial victim for US, or to be more precise, neocon prestige. That's all it is. A peace which preserves Ukraine and opens up the possibility of restoring some kind of stability to Europe is in Ukraine's interest, obviously, and it is in the US interest. It is astonishing, it is very alarming that articles like this continue to be written, and it tells us about the nihilism of the people who I have been talking about, and we on the Duran have been talking about, well, for at least the last 3 years. Anyway, this leaves little time to discuss the situation in Ukraine today, but I'm only going to just deal with a few further points. Firstly, the failure of Ukraine's counterattack in the Kursk pocket has now opened the way for the Russians to make big advances. And it looks as if not just the village of Russkaya Porechnoye has been recaptured by the Russians, but apparently the Russians are now in the process of capturing Cherkasskaya Porechnoye and Malaya Lopnya. So we're soon going to be left not with a Kursk pocket anymore, but with the small town of Sudzha, with the Russians in control of villages located 1.5 kilometers from the center of Sudzha. It's going to be reduced to that, with the troops in Sudzha, the Ukrainian troops in Sudzha, those unlucky enough to be in Sudzha, kept supplied along a precarious road, a single road, which the Russian Air Force and helicopter gunships and drones control. A disastrous outcome, I would have thought, but apparently Syrskyi and Zelensky are refusing any idea of a retreat from there. It looks as if the Russians have significantly expanded their bridgehead in the northern part of the Oskol River near Kupiansk. Apparently, according to the military summary channel, an entire brigade could now operate from there. They've also expanded their brigade west of the Zherebets River towards Liman. Liman is now well within striking range, and it's possible that over the next few months we will see a Russian offensive towards Liman. There's growing speculation that the Russians have now taken complete control of Toretsk. There's uncertainties as to what exactly is going on, and it may be that the Ukrainians still control some buildings and things of that kind, but it looks as if the Russians are in firm control, of significantly more than 90% of Toretsk, and for all I know, they control all of it. The Russians are capturing more villages around Vozvyzhenka, east of Mirnograd. There's some speculation that this is preparations for a northern thrust by the Russians to surround Ukrainian troops south of the city of Konstantinovka. I remember discussing this very possibility in a program I did some months back. Well, we'll see. The Russians have expanded their areas of control south of Pokrovsk, which, as I said, is now being steadily encircled, and the Russians have gained more ground in Kurakhovo and in the area of Kurakhovo. Kurakhovo itself, of course, is securely under Russian control. So everything continues to go bad for Ukraine on the battlefronts. But the Washington Post tells us, bad though that is, a peace deal with the Russians would be even worse. Presumably, the alternative is to just go on doing more of the same, go on sending weapons and supplies to Ukraine, ignore Ukraine's losses, let Ukraine go down to terrible defeat, because the last thing you want to do is to agree peace. Peace, apparently, is a greater disaster than defeat. Now, if that is not nihilism, tells me what is. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on Locals, Rumble and X and our various other platforms. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. I hope, as I said, that the audio problems this time have been cured. Looking forward to speaking to you again, and have a very good day.